It is impossible to achieve the aim without suffering. It is impossible to achieve the aim without suffering.
I don't think there would be a more appropriate guest for the first program than the man we have today. He got his Bachelor's of Arts from Slippery Rock, University of Pennsylvania. He's got a Master's in Philosophy from Binghamton. He's got a PhD in Comparative Literature from Binghamton. He's currently an Associate Professor at Mercy College. And most importantly for our purposes today, he is the official club historian for the New York Cosmos. Welcome, Dr. David Kilpatrick. I can't wait to get into some of the issues that plague me about American soccer and talk about the Cosmos and talk about some of the fun stuff that's happening.
Well, it's an honor to be invited. Thanks so much for having me.
So August 3rd, Cosmos are going to kick the first ball in anger in about a quarter century. You've got to be pretty excited about that. It seems like the stars are lining up right. It seems like a lot of things are going good for the club. What more can you tell us?
That's right. Opening day is just a few days away, August 3rd at Hofstra Stadium, which is actually where everything really started for the Cosmos in 1971. The Cosmos legacy of 71 through 84 is the richest in U.S. soccer history. I think few can dispute that. You could say the Bethlehem Steel teams back in the day perhaps rival it. Certainly people like Roger Alloway will. But to me, the New York Cosmos are the reason so many of us are playing the game now. And that legacy needs to be celebrated, and at long last, it really will be celebrated in the way it should, by fans cheering a team on the field, and for it to kick off against one of our old rivals, the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, just makes it all the more sweet.
One of the unsung rivalries in American soccer history, no doubt. I mean, they passed the Hakoah New York matches in the 1920s in attendance, and would have given the Sounders a run for their money today.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look back at what was going on in '77, the Father's Day game, and then the games against the Strikers and the Rowdies, as Cosmos country really came into its own, it was a magical thing. Really, the very zenith of New York soccer history and American soccer history, and for us to be able to celebrate that by that fan base and this fan base coming back together again 2 generations later, it's a really remarkable thing.
How are things going for the team over in Old England?
I think things are wrapping up really well. They've been staying at Charterhouse. I think I'm a little bit of a progressive rock fan, so the Genesis fan in me is tickled pink over them staying where Peter Gabriel went to school. So the idea of the Cosmos rebirth, the home of Genesis, to me that's just kind of a neat pop rock connection. Of course, Genesis were a Warner Communications rock band too, so there are neat synergies between sport and education and rock and roll that are just kind of fun to play out. But yeah, it's gone well. They played a closed doors match against Gillingham and had a 1-0 lead going into the 90th minute. Did very well against Leyton Orient, particularly in the second half. Lost 2-1, but one ball just barely crossed the line, and another was a penalty. So again, heads held high and did real well against the old Carthusians, too, the Charterhouse alums last week. Another fabled team in the FA Cup lore. So a really great trip, really positive vibes coming out of the camp there, and a really wonderful way to prepare for this NASL season.
Looks like the visit has gotten some good buzz in the English press.
Absolutely. Not just English press, but really global press. I think everyone still remains enamored by the mystique of this club. It's a myth that won't die out, and that's very much what we're witnessing here is something mythical, dare I say, cosmic in the works here, where everybody has great enthusiasm for it. Even if it's vitriolic, there's passion, and I think that's good for the game.
Well, from my perspective, the Cosmos represent so much possibility and so much. There's so much there that I hope folks recognize and fans recognize, and frankly that the Cosmos grasp onto. I mean, they're as close as we have to to a club with the same opportunities as any in the world right now. I truly believe that, and I mean, I don't know if you can touch on that or follow up with that, but that's just my 2 cents.
Well, absolutely. When you think about the ambitions of those visionaries like Clive Toy and Phil Wisdom, who just passed away last week, if it wasn't for the work of people like that, working essentially in a vacuum, people were playing soccer. Look, my father was playing soccer back in the 1960s in upstate New York.
Now, there's a conspiracy. Nobody was playing soccer in the 1960s.
But yeah, yeah, that's the tale a lot of people like to spin. Yeah, but what those visionaries did is they, working with grassroots players already. If you look at those Cosmos sides that were quickly assembled in 71, 72, those were local players, and they obviously took the game up another notch in ways that, say, the Generals or the Skyliners were unable to. So in terms of pro soccer, obviously, just a complete vacuum. But building upon what players were there, it was a really remarkable thing that they accomplished. And always the ambitions were to be one of the world's true super clubs. And that's what Clive Toy will tell you was in their eye right from the get-go. And that kind of ambition and what they accomplished in pursuing that mission is something we need to celebrate. And celebrating that legacy, being aware of that legacy, I think, as a New York soccer fan, as an American soccer player, to me, it really is the soil from which we grow, and we need to acknowledge that and not pretend that the game started in the mid-'90s.
Speaking of the recently departed, I wish so badly that Giorgio Canaglia was still with us and stirring the pot on this. I would have loved to hear his take on the current situation. I can't help but think that he would be as excited as anybody for the rebirth of the Cosmos, or the reboot of the Cosmos, depending on how you want to say it.
Well, he was dynamite. Love him or loathe him, or maybe a little bit of both. It certainly was a charismatic character, and I think that's it too. One thing in speaking with people who knew him, loved him, and those who hated him, he certainly was a man of many masks, and was able to play those roles really, really wonderfully. And yeah, we'll be celebrating that legacy. Giorgio Jr. is going to be there Saturday.
Wow.
Yeah. So so again, it's about the generations. It's not just about celebrating the past. It's also moving forward into the future.
Yeah, I saw where Bill Peterson was talking about how wherever he goes, somebody's got a Cosmos story. My dad took me to the Cosmos game. It was the greatest thing. It really introduced me to soccer. One of the guys that helped me set up my website, who's no longer that big of a soccer fan, he was one of the casualties of our consistent failures. He said that I said, it must have been great. You had Pele right there. He grew up in Brooklyn. He said, Pele, we went to the games to see Giorgio. My dad took me to the games to see Giorgio Canaglia. That was the guy who we said. And it kind of felt like almost a New York Yankees, a DiMaggio versus Ruth kind of thing, and just sort of the depth of that and how that manifested itself. I just thought that was really interesting.
Well, I think really, you have to look to Archie Stark or Davy Brown in the history of American soccer for anyone to rival them. But Canaglia really came here in his prime. He left Lazio when he was very much at his scoring peak, and that carried over in his time with the Cosmos. But of course, he had some really great service from the likes of Beckenbauer and Nayskins and Bogicevic, and Pelé playing as a false nine with him. You had a lot of talent surrounding him there. But of course, it takes talent to thrive amidst talent. And his talent was not only on the pitch. Canaglia also was very media savvy. He developed really strong relationships within Warner. A lot of people talk about that, but he also had great relationships with the press. He knew how to generate press. He knew how to spin a good story. And so while there was a lot of intrigue behind the scenes, also the Cosmos didn't shy away from letting some of that intrigue leak out, because the stories that were being spun were really quite compelling and remain so.
Yeah, speaking of compelling, I think one of the things that I always want to impress upon people when I talk to them is, you might reach back 25 years for the Cosmos, but if you reach back another century, you're going to find soccer in New York, and you're going to find it embedded into the culture and society and sports fans and everything else. It's been part of New York consciousness for a long time. And you know, going back, like you mentioned, to Archie Stark, I mean, and guys like Davy Brown and guys like the New York Hakoah guys and Indiana Flooring and a good half dozen other teams of note in the 20s, and then another probably half dozen teams of note in the 30s and 40s and 50s and through the 60s with ISL. I mean, the New York soccer legacy is something you can't. I don't think people have even remotely recognized it in the way they should. It's always it seems as though it's one of those underestimated forces out there in soccer, and I'm the guy who says I'm glad the Cosmos are trying to fulfill that legacy.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're tracing the history of pro soccer in New York, you have to go with 1894, when the American League of Professional Football Clubs started up. It was an initiative of the National League ownership groups. You're talking Boston, New York, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and D.C. But they all had their football clubs, and things were a little bit delayed by the equivalent of the World Series, which was won by the Giants, the New York side, and that delayed the season just a little bit. And then when they got going, those games in 1894, beginning in October, mid-October, they were playing those in the middle of the day on a weekday. Now, even today, you're going to have a hard time getting people out in the middle of the day. But to check out a brand new team, that's tough. But there are a lot of other different economic factors.
So they were planning on, we're talking heading into a winter season?
We're talking mid-October, and an ambitious schedule, and 6 games into the season, the league folded. The Lord knows what would have happened, but even the backstory beyond that is even more fascinating, I think, in terms of what's coming up in the next few days here in New York. What really spurred that league was an exhibition game between a New York 11 and a Philadelphia 11, but the New York team that went and played in Philadelphia in a game that was witnessed by the Philadelphia Phillies baseball owner, what became known as the Phillies. Back then you would have called them the Philadelphia Quakers if you called them anything but Philadelphia. But the Philadelphia National League baseball owner was there to watch an exhibition between Philadelphia All-Star team, and the team from New York was the Cosmopolitan Association Football Club. And the local press in New York would affectionately call that team, guess it, Cosmos. And this Cosmopolitan Association Football Club team had cultivated enough of a rivalry with Philadelphia that it drew big enough crowds to interest those baseball owners. So in many ways, it really did all begin with the Cosmos way back when.
It was always my understanding that Clive or Phil or one of those guys pulled Cosmopolitans from Metropolitans.
Well, Clive Toy, when he came up with that name and using precisely that logic, when he did that, this was news to Clive recently, to be honest with you. That's how lost and forgotten American soccer history is. A couple of those players from that Cosmopolitan team played for that New York team in the professional league, which really was just known as New York. A lot of soccer historians like to call them the New York Giants because of the shared ownership with the baseball club. But they're basically New York, just referred to as New York. So it all began in 1894, and again in the grassroots circles preceding that, beginning around 1890 or so, where the idea of sporting professionalism was just starting to emerge on these shores and in foreign shores. What was going on in England with professionalizing the Football League is very parallel to what was happening, of course, with the National League in baseball here. So one can imagine how different things would be if, just as those baseball clubs are surviving, some of them in different cities now, but if those soccer teams continued to play from 1894 on, how different would the game be here?
Okay, so a little geek warning here, but I'm going to go into to some theory, and one of the ways that David and I first went back and forth was on was on two sort of opposing theories on how soccer worked in the United States, why it may have failed or why the leagues have failed, and getting to sort of the systemic issues at hand that if you follow me on Twitter, you know that I like to talk about. The first guy in this equation is a guy named Andrej Markovits, who is a professor at University of Michigan. He is a proponent of and I suspect he's the guy who actually coined the American exceptionalist theory of soccer, which, make a long story short, basically Americans can't get their head around soccer. We're not really culturally equipped to handle it. There's always been some kind of disconnect between us and the game and how it manifests itself on a different stage, and there's the different dramas involved, and we're just not wired for soccer, basically. And a guy who just recently came out with a paper named Stephen Apostolov, who's up in Massachusetts, who starts to crack open that theory and say, well, perhaps baseball forged a path through the Great Depression and embraced some marketing that soccer didn't do. Maybe if baseball or if soccer would have followed baseball's lead on things like selling scorecards and some other novel marketing stuff, radio at the time, baseball was just starting to be broadcast on radio. Perhaps that would change the dynamic, and that might have changed the course of American soccer history. And I'm kind of wondering which side you come down on that.
Well, I have to say that I kind of think in many ways they're both right, and I think both the writers deserve to be read. But I think the truth is always more complicated than oversimplified arguments. And I think when it really comes down to it, yes, a series of bad business blunders really contributed to the demise of the game in terms of its emergent popularity. If you read back through the newspapers of the 1890s, the college football game, what emerged as gridiron, was both wildly popular, but also very much imperiled by its own violence. And soccer was posed, especially in 1894, as a slightly more civilized, more spirited, and easier to follow aesthetically sport. And it could have caught on then had things been structured in the right way, as I already referenced to the days the games were being played. Another scholar I'd really point out, who left us unfortunately a year ago, is David Wangerin. And as he argues in his two books, the American Soccer League in the 1920s, just as popular as it did become, think about how more popular it would have been had it been played at better times of the year. Some of these great contests that we talk about between, say, the New York Soccer Giants and Bethlehem Steel, or these games were played in freezing conditions on pitches that
conditions.
and pitches that were just mud soup. As we like to get snooty over if a team is playing on an artificial surface or not, the conditions that they played in back then were really truly atrocious.
One of my favorite pictures from that era is Fall River was taking on one of the Pittsburgh clubs, one of the Pittsburgh powerhouses in western Pennsylvania, in the dead of winter, and instead of clearing the snow off the field, they just laid down the lines in coal dust on top of the snow. Unbelievable conditions in those times were just commonplace.
Well, that's just it. I mean, I think the conditions in which these games are played, and for quite some time they were thriving. But again, what was happening socioeconomically in the country in 1931-32, when the American Soccer League in its first iteration really went kaput. And again, the revived American Soccer League, even though it picked up shortly thereafter, didn't acknowledge its predecessor in its record keeping. It didn't. There was some sense of closure there, and for me, it's very much with the Giants winning that championship.
Yeah, I've noticed our leagues have a tendency to do that.
Yeah, and then the people that invested in the game, for whatever reasons, and we can theorize about why they may have done this, but I think in many ways they decided to go with the idea that small is bigger, or at least better for them, and they didn't really pursue the big time in the way that I feel to this moment the game should be here. I think America is a sporting nation, and so when it comes to the linkages between sports styles and American exceptionalism, I don't necessarily find it valid. You know, we were a very diverse and global city in 1894, and again through the 1920s and 30s, and very much remain so here in New York. You know, it's a shame that Davy Brown isn't held with the same status as Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. Um, so it really comes down to some of the the key leaders at certain times making certain business decisions, and that's valid for the early 30s as much as it is in the mid 80s.
Okay, David. I know you're not a dyed-in-the-wool promotion relegation supporter. Certainly not of my huge caliber, but I got to get you to face the music. I mean, you're on the show. There's really nothing I can do but give it to you, give you the full Monty. Why can't we sort of, as we move away from this American exceptionalist theory, and if Apostolov is right, and I feel like you acknowledge some of his points, is there any way we can incorporate promotion and relegation into that narrative? Can we say that because there just aren't any examples of American-style closed soccer leagues of unlimited clubs that is certainly in the top flight that have survived in the long term? Is there something about this system that can't accommodate these clubs, and shouldn't we be at least acknowledging the possibility that in order to offer our clubs the same opportunities as any in the world, we're going to have to open our leagues and implement promotion and relegation?
Well, let's take a different approach to that and look at baseball, America's pastime, as we like to call it, right? If you want to talk about sport and American exceptionalism, you have to start with baseball, of course, where professional sport, team sport started here. And it's my understanding that when the National League contemplated league structure, Connie Mack argued strongly against promotion relegation. Now, you know, I don't really want to be quoted on that. This is just a memory of something I read in passing in my uncle's library a few years ago. But I'm sure baseball scholars would find something of great interest there in terms of something we just kind of take for granted, right? People here just assume a certain league structure, and those familiar with sporting league structures elsewhere, of course, see the alternative. So, how different would baseball be with promotion and relegation is, I think, a question for baseball historians, of course, but also it's something maybe baseball want to consider, would want to consider. My National League team are the Pittsburgh Pirates for marital reasons, and if you look at what that franchise went through the years and years of futility, what would a promotion relegation race have meant to a city like that? But again, there's a ceiling there on failure, and there's a ceiling there on success, or should I say, there's a basement from failure that you can't plummet to. But is that really what's best for sport business? Well, it depends on what shareholder you're talking to, of course. But
I mean, I think that the business argument gets convoluted immediately for me. I think any business that enjoyed the perks of professional pro sports in the United States in the closed league system, I think any business would want that model. And frankly, I think Don Garber and some of these guys are out there pitching that model to the rest of the world. It's not. Some people want to paint that as kind of a revolutionary new idea in economics, and you know me, I tend to say this is kind of old school cartel stuff. But I just think that somewhere I think that a lot of the limits that go with closed leagues, and as we've seen throughout the 20th century with salary caps coming into place and all of this other stuff that tends to help a closed league in an isolated situation in its own little world, maybe that doesn't necessarily work for a game like soccer, where maybe you have to limit your teams to keep them in a closed league, but without the unlimited teams, you can't send these guys overseas to play on a level playing pitch with any team in the world.
Well, one thing I would also point to, though, is also the concept of a domestic league, and how things are changing in the era of globalization. I think not only are you going to see sporting structures evolve and transform in the very near future, I think you're going to see it happening here and all around the world. And I mean, if you look at what's going on with the league structure in Scottish football right now, it's really a travesty. Something isn't working there; it needs to be fixed. And Scotland's not alone in that regard. That's a great soccer nation, and people couldn't be more passionate about the sport than there. And yet, it's an absolute disaster right now, and they need to try to fix it. These new initiatives, will they fix it? I know you don't want to go into foreign shores with a conversation, but I think you necessarily have to really think about where the game is going right now, and to what degree national federations help or hinder that growth, and where the economics of the game will simply take things necessarily. But I think sport is about competition, and obviously that seems like such an obvious thing to say, but when you put certain things in practice that hinder competition, well, then competition is compromised. And I would like to see things evolve to a point where the most ambitious can be rewarded accordingly. And that doesn't just mean dollars or euros or pounds being thrown at the team, but real sporting ambition should be rewarded. And I'd like to see, again, I'm biased as a New Yorker, but I want to see a New York soccer team that's ranked and rated as among the world's greatest clubs.
Now, one of the tendencies and one of the coincidences I've noticed is that every single top flight soccer league of unlimited clubs that remains closed ultimately fails. Do you think that a top flight soccer league can survive closed while granting its clubs the same opportunities as any in the world? I mean, I know that starts to sound like one of my sound bites, but I think that's the question. I mean, can I mean, you look at NASL or ASL and they seem to suffer sort of the same problems of stagnation and cellar dwellers and clubs that can't compete, and then they have to purge the club out of the league, or things have to get ugly, or perhaps I'll be called making some kind of conspiracy theory here, but perhaps we're seeing the same thing with Chivas USA, where MLS can't quite figure out what to do with Chivas USA, and something ugly has to happen in order to get that club transitioned or changed into something else. And maybe that's another example of that syndrome. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess I'd just say that I think change is underway, both locally and globally in the game. That soccer has become such a ubiquitous presence in contemporary culture, and the way in which we communicate and relate through the game to the world as a whole means that the institutions and governance of the game will have to change accordingly. But of course, institutional change is tends to be behind the curve, right? But I think we are going to see some real paradigmatic change in the near future that will be positive.
Do you see a European closed pan-European league on the horizon? Do you think that's coming?
We've heard talk about it for years enough, but I think when you try to look in the crystal ball, that's one of the possibilities anyone sees, don't you think?
I think it appeals to owners right off the bat, but I can't imagine, and the fans I've spoken to over there, they say there is absolutely no way that you could just simply rip these local country leagues apart, especially in the big nations, and put these clubs into an only European league. The fans I've spoken to said we're just not going to have it. And by the way, we're not going to have anybody pulling out our promotion relegation system either. And that's just, no matter how much sense it makes for the owners, it's the supporters that are going to make the final call. And the supporters I've spoken to said, no way, no how.
Well, look,
so I think that seems like it's a big roadblock. Now I might be overestimating it, but it seems like it's got to be something.
Well, I think if you just look at the institution of the Premier League in England in 1993 and look how it completely changed the dynamics of the game there, when really things had stagnated, not just tactically, but very much in the stands. We see something very, very different now, and some rather justifiably decry that and long for the glory days, and others see something really wonderful. What better emblematizes that than the shift of Arsenal from Highbury to Ashburton Grove? The game's changed, and certain competitions mean more than they did before. The game is going to grow. Let's like to think that the history of soccer will be several hundreds of years. Let's try to look into that future. What would that entail? Well, I mean, think how different we get around just as New Yorkers from 1894. It's inconceivable. It's absolutely mind-boggling to think about how the world has changed in that span of time.
Yeah, the streets of New York City were as bad as the pitches.
Probably worse. But the idea of jumping on a train and going anywhere around New York City, and then the idea of driving out to Giant Stadium to see the Cosmos. Think of the changes that happened in the world in that time. And I think when you look in terms of European football and the emergence of the Champions League as the competition that it's become, it has changed radically in the past 30 years, and will continue to. I think America is not going to be immune to those changes in the game.
So finally, let's just throw the pro rel cat out of the bag one more time. Bill Peterson said on Twitter that he'd be interested in having a promotion relegation conversation with MLS, and NPSL is making noises about it, developing the system themselves. Do you think Bill is looking to really join the world market here, or is this something different? Or it seems as though it feels real, and a lot of people out there are saying, well, he just said it on Twitter. It's not, this is not a big deal. But let me tell you something, as somebody who's been following this debate for 3 or 4 years, that's huge. I mean, both those leagues coming out recently and even talking about Perel, as well as, a half a dozen minor league or lower division owners that I'm aware of. I mean, it seems as though this has a little bit of momentum. Do you think it's marketing, and do you think it's real? These guys want it? Do they, where do you think that's coming from?
Well, I don't want to dodge your question, Ted, but I just want to say that I think the North American Soccer League in its first iteration was really blessed by the leadership and vision of Phil Wisnam, and his loss is something that those of us who care about American soccer, we really need to take the time and remember him for his great contributions to the game on our shores. But the revived North American Soccer League has likewise benefited from wonderful ethical leadership. With David Downs, of course, I think he was a great commissioner. He's a man of sound judgment and strong character. I admire him deeply, and I think that was a great call by the Board of Governors to bring him in and put him at the helm of the ship as the league came back into North American soccer play. And he's been succeeded by somebody in Bill Peterson, who again is somebody who's really impressive. I think he understands soccer and its potential in this country, and I think he longs for what's best for the game.
From what I understand, David Downs knew that he was playing with fire by going after the Cosmos, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for throwing that out there. I mean, to me, it made just the different structures of the NASL and MLS, and how teams can actually, or owners can actually own teams in NASL. it just seemed like a no-brainer that the Cosmos would end up and back in NASL someday. And Downs going after the Cosmos, I think that probably rubbed some folks in MLS and U.S. soccer the wrong way, and God bless him for doing it, I say.
Well, I think David Downs is highly regarded amongst all American soccer circles, and I've never heard anyone say a bad word about him. But I have to agree with you. Absolutely, it was a wonderfully refreshing bit of news to hear that the Cosmos would be back in the NASL, and I have to say, as we're just days away from beginning the fall season with the NASL, it feels like home. It just feels really great to be able to say the New York Cosmos are playing the Fort Lauderdale Strikers next Saturday in the North American Soccer League.
Absolutely.
It sounds and feels just right.
And so one more question and we'll be done. I promise I'll let you go. In my mind, league competition has always been kind of a disaster. Do you see it in American soccer? It's led to the collapse of different leagues. I mean, ASL versus NASL in the 70s and 80s, and ASL versus the Federation and other leagues in the 1920s. Do you think this competition between MLS and NASL, which I think is real, do you think that's going to be a healthier? Is it going to be managed better, or should we expect that it's going to create a better outcome?
Well, I don't think we should be surprised that there's growing interest in the game by investors, which is very much in relation to demand. And as there's greater and greater demand, there needs to be better and better product. And as better product generates better demand and vice versa, I think we're necessarily going to see structural changes in the game over the next generation and beyond. I don't think that that's anything that's ever going to stop. And I think ultimately the greatness of the game is what's going to carry it through any challenges that come its way. Certainly the history of American soccer is one of, as David Wangerin said, missed opportunities. But those failures are something we can learn from. And there are those successes too that we really need to celebrate. And for me, as a New York soccer fan, that's why I've got the smile on my face right now, is because the team of my childhood, the Cosmos, are back, and right now my focus is on beating the Strikers next Saturday.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that any competition, and I've been trying to sort of posture the promotion relegation debate this way with some other folks too. Even if we don't get promotion relegation in the short term here, any debate and any competition and it's healthy. I think it's very healthy for MLS. I think it's very healthy for the entire system. It just keeps everybody pushing forward. And I think if we don't challenge the system and we don't challenge the structure, we're going to get what we deserve. We're going to get a league that's not challenged. We're going to get clubs that aren't challenged. We're going to get a system that's stagnant. So just the conversation in and of itself, and the competition between leagues, I think it can only be healthy as long as everybody knows what we're getting into, and as long as everybody knows that we're not going to let it harm the game at the end of the day. Well,
I think we're at a point in American soccer. We're no longer talking about will the game survive. We're talking about how best it can thrive. And
absolutely,
it's a good place to be.
I mean, you were saying that we want to make sure soccer is going to be here 200 or 300 years. I mean, I don't think there's any question soccer is going to be here until the last person on the planet passes away. Just the game is too ingrained in the world itself. I can't even imagine a world that doesn't have soccer, almost no matter what happens. But there we go.
It is a beautiful game.
Thanks, David, for engaging me on the old debate, and thanks for filling us in on the Cosmos stuff. And have a nice day.
Thanks very much, Ted. Take care.